a pleasure to be here with you tonight, to be in your beautiful, beautiful new building, new old building, wonderfully restored and updated, and it's an incredibly useful and beneficial place, because this is not only a gathering place for people, it is a place where ideas are discussed and shared and perhaps occasionally even hammered out. I may have gotten that right. In any case, it's a pleasure for me to be here with you tonight. I am, of course, on the $10 bill. That almost came to an end a couple of years ago, but it seems like I'm there for the foreseeable future. And I think most people I encounter know one other fact about me. What is that? I died in a duel. Most people don't know that. She said, Coast Guard. How many Coast Guard people do we have here? The Revenue Marine Service. What I learned, I grew up, of course, in the Caribbean. What I learned is that if you can't collect excises, if people are smuggling, you don't have revenue. And of course, so one of the first things we needed to do was to make sure taxes got paid. The other thing that was an important part of that job, it wasn't actually part of the Revenue Marine Service at that time, but the other part gives me some claim to fame in your own local area. Marine navigation was incredibly important, and coastal areas were extraordinarily dangerous, and so lighthouses needed to be built. You know, the first federal works project was the Cape Henry Lighthouse. Did you know that? 1791, and I was the Secretary of the Treasury. I was not only tasked with making sure it happened, I, as was my wont, took direct supervision over the project. I hired the engineer who built it. I checked into different kinds of stone and made sure that it be made with the most durable stone possible. It served well for many, many, many years. First federal works project. Government was modest in my time. We had no huge expectations as to what a government could do for people. Navigation, perhaps some roads, canals, delivering the mail, that was about all we foresaw government being able to do. And of course, defending people, that was an extraordinarily important part. Look to the preamble of the Constitution, that was the minimum that we thought could be done and would be done. But I digress. I also spent time in Virginia at an earlier point in my life. Do any of you have any idea when that might have been? Yorktown. I was a participant. I was the head of a light infantry regiment, battalion, that actually stormed Redoubt Number 10, helping to shrink the British lines, and of course the British realized the impossibility of their position at that point in time, and ultimately surrendered. So I was able to be a part of that extraordinarily important battle. For the 4 years before that, I had been the primary aide to General George Washington. And of course, President Washington and I formed a close working relationship. We had a minor falling out, but certainly nothing major that kept us from not recognizing the abilities of one another. But this is all taking me afield. You can ask me any questions later on that you would like to. I'm here really tonight to talk about slavery and religion. And of course, I'm talking about them in a time in which you could not recognize. By all standards of the imagination, slavery was accepted. Of course, I don't know if you know this part of your own history in the Tidewater area, but the very first slave ship came ashore or landed right by where the Point Comfort Lighthouse is now. It wasn't there then, of course. That was in 1619. In a year, the people in Massachusetts are going to celebrate the coming of the Pilgrims, the 400th anniversary, 1620. A slave ship arrived in 1619 to Virginia. As it turned out, it was under the command of British privateers. They had seized a Spanish slave ship and had taken the slaves and had brought them here. Mostly, up to that point in Virginia, people came as indentured servants. And these early slaves functioned more like indentured servants, some of them even working and obtaining their freedom. The system of slavery came and developed over really the period of the next 50 years. Why slavery? Why were there slaves being seized in Africa and other places in the first place? It never really reached this continent the way it reached the Caribbean. And do you have any reason why slavery was everywhere on virtually all of the Caribbean islands? There's a one-word answer. It's sugar. Sugar. Of course, the British had introduced tea to their people, and they also had an industrial revolution unfolding, so people had a little extra capital. They needed something to sweeten that tea with, and sugar, which heretofore had only been available to royalty, was suddenly something that everyone wanted. And of course, how do you do it? Well, you take those islands, they're wonderful climates, pretty much the same year-round. You cultivate the entire place. In many of those islands, they didn't even grow food. They would import food because sugar was such a wealthy crop. But sugar, the way it was grown, required really great amounts of labor. And of course, how did that happen? Enslaved people. And it was such a cruel system in many places that a slave could only expect to live for a couple of years, laying out the kind of labor that was expected of them. Only 2 years or so. If they were given better care and better nutrition, they might last 3 or 4. They were killed. And of course, sugar became known among the slaves early on as sugar hell. Of course, the white people called it white gold, sugar hell. But it was accepted. The slavery was in the Bible. Slavery had been taking place in many parts of the ancient world, the Greeks and the Romans. I mean, slavery was something that was accepted. And it was also a matter of law. Slaves were owned. They were contractually owned by people. And of course, initially here in Virginia, there was no real market for slaves, but as the tobacco crops began to develop, and of course later on cotton, more and more slaves became necessary and were purchased by people. Primarily the wealthy, the aristocratic. They were the ones that had the capital, that owned the land. Land in my time was deemed to be the main avenue for obtaining wealth. There was a group of French philosophers called physiocrats, and of course Mr. Jefferson and others considered themselves to belong to that school. They said wealth is generated from the land. And of course, then that wealth is used to purchase goods that are made by artisans and by others, and that is how wealth occurs in a society. They were very suspicious of this thing called manufacturing, which was happening in Europe and other places. But my point is, slavery evolved slowly, and it was a very complex system. There were many free people of color, and many of those free people of color that had developed some level of prosperity owned slaves themselves. So it was a complex but entirely accepted thing in this part of the world. And it came in 1619. I grew up in the Caribbean. I saw the worst of it. I hated slavery. My earliest memories were of those smelly ships coming into the harbor. You could smell them miles away. Coming in with these emaciated, dirty, ragged people in chains, being led down the road to a slave auction where they would be sold into the most excruciating labor for the next few years, however short their life was. They truly lived in Hobbes' state of nature, where life is nasty, brutish, and short. I saw that from my earliest days. My father was a merchant on Nevis. We later moved to St. Croix, which is, of course, now one of the United States Virgin Islands. Same economy there. I worked, beginning at about the age of 9, as a merchant clerk. I worked for a man named Kruger, and Mr. Kruger was part of a New York merchant family. And they dealt in trade that included slaves. I actually, while working for Mr. Kruger, was party to a slave auction and did whatever it was that I was asked to do in conjunction with that. But I knew I hated slavery. And I knew that I would, in some way or measure, oppose it. for the rest of my life. People say, well, Hamilton, if you opposed slavery so much and you were a part of the Constitutional Convention, why didn't you do anything about it there? We had this opportunity to form a new government in 1787, and we sat in Philadelphia coming up with it. And all I can say is that I was there with people like Dr. Franklin, who hated slavery at least as much as I did. But we knew that we had to form a new country. We were going to sink. Economically, we were doomed. We couldn't have defended ourselves if we were called upon to do that. We needed a central government, and I knew we needed a central government that had the power of raising taxes and producing things that were needed for the common defense. So, like so many, we didn't talk about slavery. We worked compromises with the gentlemen from the South. The 3/5 clause, each slave would, with no rights, no actual rights, would be counted as 3/5 of a human being for representation by white Southerners in Congress. We went along with those things because not to go along with them would have sacrificed our primary purpose. And this is what I think I need to make as clear to you all tonight as I possibly can. Our central purpose was to survive. We had been through a terrible war with Great Britain. Everyone was bankrupt. No one had any money. We couldn't get to that next step without developing some sort of unity and creating a basis for prosperity. And that became my life's work from then on. We had to become a nation, a true nation, not the confederation that we'd had before. We had to be united. And I went, as everyone else did, along with slavery, this long accepted legal practice, not because I thought it was good or thought it was right. I despised it. But I went along with it because we had to do it in order to form this more perfect union. Now, of course, those of you who know something about the Constitution know that we were going to revisit the issue of slavery 30 years later. So in 1808, that issue was revisited, and in fact, by 1807, the British had done away with the slave trade. Such an outpouring of anger and unhappiness had developed around it. So I think we knew that it was coming. I didn't oppose slavery on a national stage, but what I did do in my own state of New York was early on join the New York Society for the Manumission of Slaves, a society that was determined to end slavery in our sovereign state of New York. I was its president at one point. And there were many people who were committed to ending slavery, like Mr. Jay, John Jay, who was, of course, the governor of New York and eminent. It was a mistake. Right now here, you've got to be very careful. You've got to put a lot of financial resources forward. Robert Carter had those resources and actually was able to give each and every one of his slaves their own land and equipment, and they did very, very well. Some of the Randolphs in the area of Farmville, same thing, were able to free their slaves, put them on land, give them the kind of resources they needed to succeed. But not very many people were willing to. And Edward Coles realized the only way he would be able to do it ultimately was by taking his slaves and leaving Virginia, which he did. And on his way to Illinois, which by that time was a free state, he freed his slaves in the middle of the Ohio River between Kentucky and Illinois. Set them up on farms. Those communities survive even to this day. It was being done. It was a movement that was gaining, I think, momentum, but it had not gotten as far as it should. So one asks, what role did religion play in this, if any? Well, it probably played a huge role. You know, some of the most ardent enemies of slavery were Quakers, religious people, people whose beliefs convinced them that it was wrong to own another human being. And there were others, the Baptists. One of the reasons the Baptists were an enemy of the state church here in Virginia, the Anglican Church, was because many of them thought that was entirely wrong. There were people who were opposed to slavery, and it was gaining momentum. And I knew that in my lifetime, well, I didn't live nearly long enough, but if I had lived longer, I would have seen, I think, the end of slavery. I did live to see it end in New York. We knew it was wrong, but it had become a widespread practice. And I think many slave owners believed that it was a profitable practice. And if one talks to people like the Carter family, Mrs. Carter was convinced that they could make more money simply by letting their land be rented than they could ever do it operating a slave plantation. I think people with enough foresight and vision realized that it was wrong. But you know, you have to get people convinced to new ideas. It doesn't happen easily. And that's why one of the most important things I always thought I needed to do was to be able to express my views and get people to try to think of new ways to look at old problems. And that was one of them. Another thing that complicates discussing religion, of course, in the 18th century is that we didn't talk about it. By and large, we didn't talk about religion. And the most that most ministers would say was, slave owners, take good care of your slaves. Make sure they American slaves better off than their African cousins, because they could become Christians. Academy. These were ideas that General Washington and I talked about. They were incredibly important, but we didn't have anything when our new armaments and supplies, and you can defend yourselves. That's why I knew we needed a national bank. So we almost lost the War of 1812 because we didn't have one. And of course, I think it was another of your presidents, Andrew Jackson, who decided we didn't need a bank. You had a terrible panic and wiped many, many people out financially. I set up a good system. Mr. Jefferson, of course, was always suspicious of my system. He was suspicious of me personally, but more, he didn't like banks, and he didn't like bankers. Can you imagine why? He owed a lot of money, and he owed it to bankers, of course. He's in agriculture. You know, if you have a bad year, you got to go borrow money to have enough money to plant the next year. Southern farmers did not like banks, but I knew it was essential for national defense. I was thinking always about our national self-interest. That, to me, was exactly my vision of what we needed to do. If it was good for the United States, we needed to do it. If it was bad for the United States, we shouldn't do it. And that was always my view. I also had another belief that it was based, here again, I was an attorney, I believed in contracts. And the Constitution of the United States is a contract between the sovereign people and their rulers. And the one thing that is required of the people is obeying the contract. So if you don't like laws, well, change them. But you've got to obey the law. It's absolutely essential that the law be obeyed or changed. To violate the law, to do it routinely, will lead to despotism. Absolutely, I'm convinced. I said you can have a government of law or you can have a government of force, but you cannot have both. So, anyway, the inviolability of law, contract, all of that contributes to my views at that period of time in our history, despite my own personal differences. And it also, I think, explains why I made a lot of the decisions that I made. But I think I probably should stop right now and give you the opportunity to ask any questions that you might want to ask me about anything. And I not only know what happened in my lifetime, as you can guess, I have a pretty good idea of what followed. So even though I died in 1804, you can talk about things that happened after I lived. So, shall we do that?
The bank that you wanted for the United States, would it be called the Bank of the United States? And is it something where people would deposit checks, take out loans, and if that's the case, would you see that as the only bank in the United States?
Did you all hear the question? So I don't need to repeat it? No, there were other banks. There was the Bank of Philadelphia, there was the Bank of New York, there were in the major metropolitan areas, there were banks, private banks. The Bank of the United States, I viewed, as I said, here again, I've been called an Anglophile, that I love the British. No, they had a great system. They did a lot of things that really worked well. And one of them was banking. And I liked their banking system for what a country could do at a time of crisis or war. It could borrow a lot of money in a hurry. Now, how does it get this money? Well, you create securities and so on. We had a national recovery. Everything was worthless after the Revolutionary War. Within a few years, of course, then we have the Constitutional Convention in 1787. New government begins in 1789. We had a remarkable recovery in a few years by selling worthless debt, what was considered worthless a few years before, worthless debt that was backed by some specie, by some gold and silver, Western land, but mostly it was backed by something, and you all know this phrase, by the full faith and confidence of the United States of America. Now, where does that come from? By the way, a government without confidence is a government in trouble. Full faith and confidence. Well, we did everything we could to create a confident environment. Our Constitutional Convention would have been a great thing, even if we hadn't had certain people there, but it would have failed without General Washington and without Dr. Franklin, as ill as he was. These were two of the most universally admired people in the country. They lent their gravitas to our proceedings. And of course, the first president is General Washington, the most loved man in American history. No one voted against him in the Electoral College either time. Universally admired. He lent his gravitas to us and to our enterprise, full faith and confidence. Well, the other part of full faith and confidence is you give people what you promise them. So if you say you're going to make interest payments, you make them regularly, and you make them for the amount that you're entitled to make them for. And you have we had a sinking fund. We were paying these notes off. We were honoring our commitment, and that's what you have to do if you want people to believe in your system and to invest in your enterprise. And also, a lot of people don't like to hear this, but I knew if the wealthy didn't support it, it would not succeed. The American Revolution was not, the bleeding and the dying was done by ordinary people, but the people who were making the decisions were the wealthy, the intelligent, they were the people of advantages. It was a conservative social revolution. And our government was a conservative sort of government as we began it. We needed for them to be involved. And of course, banking is a place that the wealthy will tell you early on whether they're supporting you or not. And they supported our bank. And a lot of people made a lot of money, and there was a lot of prosperity generated initially, and lots of people worked. We had revenues coming in. We didn't have direct taxation for the most part in our time. We had taxes on imported goods, on luxury goods, but I also knew that we had to manufacture, because here again, from a national defense standpoint, if you can't make it here, when a war starts, you're not going to be able to get it. You have to have your own military goods, and you have to have those industries that are absolutely essential for the production of military goods, those mines and factories. So always I was thinking in terms of our survival as a nation. So banks, huge role in creating prosperity, but that's not why I thought they were especially essential. We needed them to be able to wage war if and when it happened again, and I knew it would. I was a student of history. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, did you have any dealings with the Native Americans in your time in government?
Did I have any dealings with the Native Americans? I did indeed. I was one of the founders of a college, Union College, which is now called Hamilton College, and it was a college essentially for Native Americans. Our Society for the Manumission of Slaves started a school for African children in New York. I was always involved in trying to help with the education of indigenous peoples and, of course, slaves and former slaves. Absolutely essential. What I realized growing up with slaves in the Caribbean was that they were every bit as intelligent as we were. They had been living in a society in which they hadn't had opportunities to demonstrate their competencies, but I certainly knew they had them. Some of my earliest playmates were African American children. So I thought education was incredibly critical and important. So yes, I did. There were a lot of indigenous people up in northern New York. So.
At the time of your death, and please remind us what your age was at that time, but you must have had hopes and dreams for the next 10 to 20 years. What did you think would happen? What were you planning to work on?
I died at 47. So I was 47 years old. You know, I spoke not long before my death with a friend of mine named Chancellor Kent, who became a distinguished New York jurist, and I said, I intended to commission and write a volume on thinking, on philosophy, and I had various people in mind that I wanted to write different chapters in this book for. But I think I knew how to find basic principles, first causes. By the way, if you buy anything tonight, there's a little thing, a brief look at how Alexander Hamilton reasoned. And I'm sure even if you don't want to buy something, you could probably talk the person at the desk into giving you a copy. I prided myself on my ability to reason. I looked for maxims, I looked for first principles. I said, just as there are laws in mathematics, so there are in politics and other human activities. I studied. I was once called a genius, and I said, men give me credit. This is the genius I have. When I have a task before me, when I'm supposed to think about something, I become pervaded with it. I think about it day and night. I think about it from every vantage point imaginable. And then when I act, that which others are pleased to call the fruit of genius, I would call the fruit of hard work and thought. I devoted myself to seeing things as clearly as I could. I was a frustrating attorney to have in some cases, because people would come and they would say, Mr. Hamilton, we want you to represent us. And I would say, give me the particulars of your case. And it might take me a month or two to answer. But I had to look at it ahead of time, see it from both the plaintiff and the defendant's side, and try to solve the case. And of course, if I thought it was unsolvable, I would say, I'm sorry, you have no case here. You really need to go make a settlement with this person. If I thought I could win it and I thought it was just, then I would undertake it. I was very particular about who I represented and why. I was asked once by a very wealthy man who pushed a pile of gold across the table to defend him when he was attempting to take money from young people that he was entrusted to represent. And I pushed this money back and said, you are duty-bound, honor-bound to give them this money. So I believed in virtue. And that's a word that's disappeared from our vocabulary, I think, in your time. Virtue. What is virtue? I believe that we need to do the right thing for the right reasons whenever we possibly can. And I devoted my life to doing that. I undertook some unpopular cases. I found myself misunderstood. I know after we had the Jay Treaty negotiated with Great Britain, it was a commercial treaty. It really was the final piece in establishing the post-revolutionary relationship between the United States and Great Britain. I was attempting to explain it to a group of people in New York City, and they were pelting me with rocks and bricks. But I always felt it was absolutely essential that we do the right thing. And I'll share with you, I got this from my Presbyterian mentor on the island of St. Croix, a man named Hunox. It's a saying, it's an ancient saying, the truth is powerful and will prevail. The truth is powerful and will prevail. I had another motto. That was perseverando. Perseverando. Persevere. And I also believed in persevering. Prince Talleyrand, who was Napoleon's foreign minister, was in exile for a while, as were many during the French Revolution from time to time. He was in exile. I got to know him quite well in Philadelphia. And one day he was walking late at night past my house, and he saw the light upstairs. And he said to the man that he was with, there is the man who made the fortune of his nation, laboring all night to support his family. I believed in that. I did not profit from my service as Secretary of the Treasury. Mr. Jefferson thought I must have gotten filthy rich when he became president. He sent his Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, to find all the money that I had stolen, to locate it all, and to see that I was punished as I ought to be. Well, Mr. Gallatin in 6 months came back and said, Mr. President, not only is there not a cent that is unaccounted for, but this is the most perfect financial system that has ever been devised. Mr. Jefferson didn't make any other attempts to change it. I didn't profit from things. I actually cost myself money to which I was entitled. I was a member of the Continental Congress. We were debating how we would take care of our soldiers as they were being demobilized after the Revolutionary War. And one of the things being discussed in the Congress was what arrangements were going to be made for paying the officers. So there was a proposal for half pay for life to those who had served as officers in the war. The enlisted people were getting land and other bonuses. But I had been an officer during the Revolution, and I did not think that as a virtuous man I could sit there and discuss something in which I would profit, perhaps. So I wrote a letter and renounced all claim to half pay or any other arrangement that they made for officers, so that when I was standing there in this assembly of the representatives of the people, I would be able to do that which was right without my own self-interest being in the way. I learned early on that self-interest is the greatest survived in its infancy was by maintaining strict neutrality. So we were able to say to the French, we made that treaty with the King of France, you've executed him. We have no obligation to honor that treaty with you. I was interred.
I read that when you were little, you and your brother were not allowed to take communion because you were illegitimate. Did that color your views of religion at all as you grew up?
This is an embarrassing thing for me to talk about, you know, really, but I can do it now because I think you will understand that my illegitimacy is not an illegitimacy of two people who didn't love each other. Mine is an illegitimacy of the law acknowledging that a man had rights and a woman didn't. My mother was divorced. She was forced by her mother into an abusive relationship. A man spent all of her money and any money he could get a hold of. She fled from him. This was on the island of St. Croix. She fled from him to St. Kitts and then later to Nevis. She met the man who was my father, James Hamilton, who was a merchant, and they married. But her divorce from the first husband, which he had obtained, said he can remarry, but she couldn't. She had no rights. And so my illegitimacy isn't because my parents didn't love one another and get married. My illegitimacy is because she had no rights and he did. And what did I say early on? I said the law has ruined many a good family.
Yes, General Hamilton, I have a question about the Unitarian Universalist faith. That your colleague, Mr. Jefferson, once was roughly quoted as saying that there is not a man born today who will not someday become a Unitarian. And I wonder about your opinion about why this did not happen.
Wow, and I'm wondering why you Unitarians are taking Jefferson's name off things right now. That's another story. Mr. Jefferson was not, in my opinion, remarkable from a religious standpoint. He was a fairly classic deist, and there were many people around in my time who were deists. A great many of them in France, Mr. Jefferson associated with a lot of them. It's interesting that I think it was Mr. Rousseau, whenever he would have a dinner party, and they were going to talk about irreligion, they would always make sure the servants had gone away and couldn't overhear the conversation. I think they realized they were talking about things that were going to affect the people around them. Deism, you know, it's a view that there is a creator, and the creator, they use the clock analogy frequently. It's like a complicated clock that gets wound and then it just runs on its own. You know, that I think was a view that was not extraordinary. I was a Christian, actually, although I didn't run around telling everyone I was. I truly believed in a God who was operating in human history. Of course, I guess one could argue that deists believe in that to some degree or another because something creates the clock, and the clock somehow gets wound and it somehow runs. And does it run along principles that are logical and understandable? I don't know. But no, I had no desire to become a Unitarian, Universalist. I was comfortable going to Trinity Church in New York. My wife associated a great deal, I think, with a number of Presbyterians. She was one of the founders of the society in New York that took care of orphan children that still exists to this very day. I think we believe that our religious beliefs should affect how we live our lives and what we should do. We always contributed liberally when people were in need. I think for me that was a view that worked well. Should it be yours? Jefferson was great when he talked about religion. What did he say? He said, whether you believe in one God or 20 gods, either picks my pocket or breaks my leg. It's totally a matter of your own opinion. And I think most of the people who were in Philadelphia thought that America needed to be a land of religious freedom, where everyone had perfect opportunity to worship as they pleased or not to worship. It's not a matter of concern before the very first. That was a view that I had very recently. Great question. Why did we write the Federalist Papers? We had finished our work in Philadelphia, and each state was going to be required to ratify the new Constitution. And there were some in which it wouldn't be a very significant problem, but the view of the government would be something that most people would separate. In some places, it was just more.
Bruce, I also had to read the Federalist Papers, just finished them for my master's from the MPS, so I really liked that. But back to the duel. Almost in a selfish way, what was it that made y'all think that that was a good idea? You know?
Well, as I understand it, in the play Hamilton, that refrain echoes through the room at some point. What were you thinking? I didn't answer your question. Federalist Papers, why? We had to sell the Constitution. We had to get it ratified. And so these were explaining what the new laws intended, what the new Constitution intended, and it was also attempting to answer all of the objections that were out and about, and we were trying to respond to them. It becomes almost settled law, through the course of its history. Supreme Court seconds, and they communicate back. There would be opportunities to resolve all of that. But unfortunately, in this case, murder was not going to be mollified no matter what happened. I was left with no choice other than to go. So I did. I broke the law. We both broke the law. One of the reasons dueling was done in the way that it was done, only each man had a second. And there was a physician, but the physician didn't even see what was happening. So shots would ring out. The doctor would come running up, in my case, and attempt to treat me, but he hadn't seen anything. And each second had what might be called plausible deniability. Colonel Burr's second said, I fired first. And my second said, I didn't fire, the bullet went off after I was struck. My pistol went off after I was struck. So it was not an ethical practice. I think on further reflection, you're absolutely right. I shouldn't have done it. I certainly put my family through a lifetime of hell because of it. But I believed in honor, and of course, dueling was a part of the military code. It primarily grew out of military service. It was common among military officers. I've been involved in 11 what they call the pairs of honor. But as I said, 10 of them resulted in everything they did. It was really a way of negotiating. Until you're dealing with someone like Burr who really wasn't safe. I don't know that you know this, but an attorney was taking some papers to throw a house before the day or 2 days before. And saw there was a big log and a lot of people. By the way, that's a violation of safety. So, it was perfect. And I should.
Your century has to teach us about exploitation. Would you
Constitution, we can pass laws, and if you could make this a more just society, it's illegal. For our constitutional system. I suspect that's what it's saying.
Why did you have to go to work so early? What happened to your father and your mother and your brother? I believe you have one. And the other question is, why was Burr so mad at you? What caused the duel?
Two very good questions. The first question is, my parents at some point split up. My father went and lived in the Reenactment. He lived in St. Vincent. And lived out his years there. I remained in contact with him, but I never saw him. My mother, of course, ran to the war. I don't think it affected him particularly.
But I really felt, we had to have the work. My mom operated a small store. My brother was apprenticed to a carpenter, and I was apprenticed to a merchant clerk. I was a very bright boy. And so by the time I was 14, he became sick. Mr. Kruger became sick and had to go back to the colonies, and I ran his business for a long period of time. I was that capable. I worked because we had to have the income, but I also believe the children should work. I believe children need to learn, they need to learn to be responsible. They need to have the satisfaction of doing something well and knowing they've done something well. And it builds self-confidence. I didn't see child labor as a horrible thing. I had worked all my life, and I wasn't angry about it. I thought it was right, and it gave me opportunities. I'd never gotten to the colonies if I hadn't been a merchant clerk and had done such an extraordinary job and attracted the attention of other people. It was incredibly important. The other question.
Why was Burr so mad?
Oh.
What made this an inevitable duel no matter what?
Well, we could spend hours from here talking about why he was so angry, but in a nutshell, the election of 1800 pitted John Adams essentially against Thomas Jefferson, Mr. Jefferson. And in that election, there was a tie in the Electoral College. Mr. Burr was running as vice president with Mr. Jefferson, and everyone knew it. But according to the Electoral College, the Constitution had some flaws in it, and this is one of them. According to the Constitution, if you have a tie in the Electoral College, it doesn't matter whether it's running for president or vice president, Mr. Jefferson and Colonel Burr had the same number of votes. When there's a tie in the Electoral College, it goes to the House of Representatives. And of course, Mr. Jefferson's faction had gotten rid of a lot of Federalists. And in that period in which that was being decided, there were a lot of people who were angry with Jefferson and with his new party. And they were willing to make deals with Colonel Burr. Burr wanted to be president. They were negotiating and working on all sorts of things. And it really appeared, there were 35 ballots in the House of Representatives, tie ballots, Jefferson versus Burr. Even though clearly one was running for president and the other was vice president. And on the 36th ballot, a shift finally took place. I had written a number of my friends who were in the House. I had explained that the worst thing that could happen to this country was if Colonel Burr became president. Because, as I said, he was a man with no fixed principles. He was I called him a proto-Caesar. If you wanted to insult someone in my time, you called him Caesar. Because Caesar was one of those men who led the army and then took over the government and then became a despot. I believe Burr was. I thought that he was a dangerous man. And Mr. Jefferson, on the other hand, I didn't disagree with a lot that he had to say, but as I said in my letter, he has some pretensions to principle. I knew he would do a good job. And I also knew the government was set up sufficiently well so that he wouldn't be able to get around it. Second, that's one reason. The second reason is Burr, his career is over. He's challenged his boss for the presidency. He's finished. and he's casting about quickly for another job. He runs for governor of New York as an independent, but trying to curry favor with the Federalist faction, which is the group that I was a part of. And of course, I opposed him there. And that was the final straw for him. He lost that election, and he was just so angry. And of course, his behavior, I think, points out very clearly that he would have been an awful president of the United States.
General Hamilton or Secretary Hamilton, whatever you want to be called, is it true that you had, early in your life, that you did argue some court cases with Aaron Burr? I mean, had him as your, you were like co-counsel, you were on the same side. And also, is it true, not true, that one time Aaron Burr helped prevent a duel between you and James Monroe?
That is true. It's all true, Mr. Knapp. Yes, sir. Burr and I were friendly. We had known one another since the Revolution. He came to let me know when my guns were set up on Hamilton Heights in New York that we needed to retreat. I had known him for many years. He was studying law in the same place I was, in Albany. My wife and I were living in a little cottage, and he was staying with my in-laws, studying. We'd known one another for years. I was friendly with Burr. We would walk, we were seen walking arm in arm down the streets of Manhattan. I just knew he would be a terrible president of the United States. He was not a trustworthy man. He was not someone you could rely on. And I know things, as I said, beyond my life, but it was interesting. It was brought to my attention not too long ago that in, I believe, 1833, before Burr died, William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist editor, interviewed Burr, and he said, "That man has no fixed moral principles." So, the leopard never changed its spots. Anyway, that was the reason it led to such acrimony.
General Hamilton, I'd like to commend you, sir, on your dedicated and distinguished service during the Revolution. During that time, I have two questions. One, my imperfect reading of history has me to the understanding that you parted ways with Washington after many years of dedicated service to him. But then you were able to follow that by gaining command just before Yorktown. I would love to have you comment on how you were able to make that happen. And secondly, once in command, and in the assault on the 14th of October against Redoubt Number 10, you went into the attack with your weapons not loaded. And would you care to comment on that?
Very good. You get to see me as a military thinker in that. General Washington had a Vesuvian temper. He didn't lose his temper very often, but when he did, it was a horrible thing. And we, his aides, quaked when it was going on. I was at the top of the stairs. I was delivering a message. The general called me. I had to finish a conversation. It was quick. I finished it. By the time I got to him, he blew up at me and said, "You have disrespected me." And I said, "No, sir, you have disrespected me, and I intend to resign." It took them 6 months to replace me, and I stayed there for that 6 months. It was not an impulsive decision. But he had spoken to me in a way that was, for people of honor, it was a way that was unacceptable to me. And obviously, I didn't burn any bridges. I was his principal aide. I was functioning much more like a chief of staff would in today's military than an aide. And I was involved in all the councils and all the decision making. The generals were all my friends. He lost my services as his aide, but he also knew I had been trying to get a combat command for quite some time. I'd started the war as an artillery company commander, and my guns were, they were among the best in the Army. I covered the retreat of our Army across the Ruritan River. If you ever are around on the Rutgers campus, right by the chapel, you could see where my guns were placed. Of course, you can't see the Ruritan, there are factories between it. But anyway, I loved a field command. And of course, I also loved the idea of achieving some sort of military glory. So I managed to eventually convince the general I was going to resign my commission completely, and he didn't want that to happen. I was able to get command of a battalion of New York Light Infantry, and of course, here again, for years I have been functioning, 4 years functioning as his chief aide. I knew everybody, and the Marquis de Lafayette was a good friend of mine. And when it became known that we intended to shorten the British, our lines, putting them further in, we needed to take Redoubt 9 and 10. They were both going to be French soldiers who engaged in that action. And I went and pled the case that it would be indecorous, so we needed an American unit as well as a French unit, so that the importance of our actual struggle would be recognized. I was given command. I had people that I loved all of my life with me. My friend Major Fish from New York. Colonel Dime was there. Oh goodness. My tutor from Elizabethtown, New Jersey, whose name is not coming to me right now, who was a colonel. He also. Anyway, a lot of people who weren't in that unit went on that operation. But what did we need to seize Redoubt number 10? We needed surprise. We needed to get as close as we could before we could be fired at. And one thing I knew about people is that, well, they'll mess up in almost any kind of situation. So if you unload your weapon, you can't have an accidental discharge that will warn everybody that you're on your way. So we were able to achieve surprise right up to the Palisades. And I actually jumped on the back of a sergeant, I'm not a very tall man, jumped on his back and left the Palisades. We also had encircled it and were able to take a great many prisoners with very few casualties. And we did it because of the element of surprise. I knew that if we had loaded weapons, one would go off halfway, we'd have cannon fire coming in on us and musket fire, and then we would be doomed. So I've always thought about things very carefully, looked at them from every side possible. And militarily people would say, well, why would you attack someone with empty weapons? Well, our bayonets were fixed. But why? Well, the answer is so we can achieve surprise. I think always I tried to imagine the best outcome and determine how we could get to that best outcome from where we were. It's a great question. Thank you. It's always going to be all the way around.
Thank you, sir. I've been on the banks of the Raritan, but that's not my question. My question is, if you approached with weapons that were unloaded, how long did it take and what was the process of loading them to be there and attack?
What could not load a musket very quickly? The flintlock, to boot. Musket fire wasn't going to be a factor. Getting into the fort, into the redoubt, with bayonets was the way we were going to succeed, and that's exactly what happened. Because of the element of surprise, we were on top of the British before they realized it, and a number of them were bayoneted. And by then, you see, this is why you need a regular military. A militia didn't even have musket or bayonet lugs on their muskets. I mean, that was a foreign weapon to them. We needed trained soldiers. You need a trained military. It's not something that amateurs can take up right away. There's a period of time, and you need professionals who can teach them. And thank goodness Baron von Steuben came and helped us around the time of me again after all these years. I literally did, every week for 10 years, sit across from him. He used to say it was the New Enlightenment radio tower in Reno. It actually was questions of arguably one of the most interesting human beings this country's ever produced. And it was fascinating. At some point, Clay said you need to dress up, and you need to be a character, and we need to debate. And so I did John Adams for quite a while, and somewhere along the line, there was a performance that required Alexander Hamilton, and I was told I needed to do it, and didn't have much time to learn about Hamilton. But I fell in love with it. Hamilton is really one of the greatest people that's ever lived. Talleyrand, who knew everybody, said that Hamilton was the smartest human being he had met on the planet, and he included the great statesmen of Europe. We don't know much about him, and unfortunately, he's always gotten involved in, it's this belief that if you like Jefferson, you can't like Hamilton. If you like Hamilton, you can't like Jefferson. I think we need them both, and that's been, I think, stated more eloquently than I ever could. But anyway, for about going on 20 years, I've been doing this occasionally, and it's a great thing. I live in rural Virginia. I write about Hamilton. I read about Hamilton. I do this all the time. And I'm so grateful to you all for giving me the chance to be here tonight, because I would expect a lot of Unitarians to be thoughtful people. That's what I'm and I can tell by the questions you are. And I'm cognizant that you are like in a place like I am right now. You don't know. You want to look to people like Jefferson with admiration. But we're living in a time where we almost believe that we can't admire them because they were flawed. And of course, Hamilton was flawed. Hamilton was involved in a tawdry affair. He paid blackmail. I mean, it's not pretty. But I think this is the thing about it. People in history, even the best of them, are flawed human beings. And I think it was said probably best by Are we there? What are we doing? I mean, anyway, I don't want to get into all that, but I think the founders can teach us a lot about a lot of things, and Hamilton knew how to think. Did he always reach the right conclusions? Probably not, but he knew how to think, and it's worth taking a hard look at these folks. High school's probably too soon to look at the Federalist Papers. I like looking at them in my 30s and 40s. I mean, I think that's when they meant a lot more to me. And I hope we all look at them every now and then. They're a part of our social compact. As the preamble says, this Constitution's being handed to the people who are living then and their posterity, which is us. And we're the posterity, and we've got to take that inheritance and do the best we can with it. So anyway, this is what I do. It keeps me off the streets, I think, most of the time. And I hope that somehow Hamilton has helped you think about things, and maybe even you might be interested enough to want to know something about him. At the very least, get one of these DVDs and watch Thomas Jefferson attack him mercilessly. And also, I have a simple little book about Hamilton, which is also available if any of you want to buy it, called Hamilton by the Slice. It's sort of topic by topic, looking at Hamilton. And since we have military people in the crowd, where would you be without a challenge coin? Alexander Hamilton challenge coin. Available also. These are fun. These are fun to to distribute around the country. This coin is at the Federal Reserve Bank, it's at New York Stock Exchange, it's in all kinds of interesting places because we need to remember these people. They're not disposable. I think that's what we're being kind of led to wanting to think about these days, that the founders, because they weren't perfect, they didn't always do the right thing, and we can't imagine doing what they were doing. Somehow they have nothing to offer us. But I think John F. Kennedy was right, the best collection of brains in the whole nation was when Thomas Jefferson was eating by himself in the White House. I mean, these people teach us a lot and still can. Anyway, thank you so much. I'll be around.